Okay, welcome to this Slips, Trips and Falls Prevention Masterclass with me, Christian Harris. Great to see so many of you on here today. We have a bunch of people on Zoom, and we also have some people watching live along with us too. So welcome, however you are joining us for this. Do get involved in the comments and the chat. Let me know that you're awake and it's all sinking in. I'm not just chatting to myself about a load of nonsense, which I'm sure I'll do my best not to do, but it's good to see you today. We've got a packed agenda. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So let's get into it. So slips, trips and falls is something that we're all aware of as a problem. But what a lot of people don't seem to recognize is that it's a very, very long running and flatlining issue. So this slide here shows the HSE data for the UK of riddles, which are the more serious types of accident. And as you can see, slips, trips and falls pretty much year after year after year for the last decade has been plus or minus 30% of all riddles. So it's flatlining. Whatever we're doing isn't improving the situation. And I talk about trying to avoid being a safety crab. So, you know, do you feel crabby about your accident statistics moving sideways? Because in my opinion, you should. We should be trying to improve, not just accepting the status quo of flatlining performance. I did an article about this actually recently on my LinkedIn newsletter. So we've got to break this status quo. There's one very smart person on this slide, and then there's me. Einstein talks about the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. And a little quote from me: death and taxes may well be inevitable, but slips are definitely not. And here's some proof of that. A few examples of clients that my team and I have supported over the years, showing quite significant reductions in accidents, injuries, and claims volumes, as well as claims costs. So it is very much possible to significantly reduce the number of slips that you suffer from in your buildings, and trips is exactly the same as well. If you don't know me, just a very quick intro. So I'm called Christian Harris. I run a business called Slip Safety Services. I regularly produce content about safety and risk management. So I have this roundtable session, which I run every couple of weeks. I have a podcast called Safety and Risk Success, and the LinkedIn newsletter that I mentioned a short while ago too. I work in the field of slips and falls, and in that arena I've acted and been involved in some pretty high profile cases. The business has won some awards. We've got some great partnerships with the likes of AXA Insurance. We've got some fantastic blue chip clients. We've helped several thousand sites over the years to reduce the risk of slips and falls, and at last count we reckon we're stopping about £10 million a year of claims. So this topic today is very much in my wheelhouse, in my area of specialism. So the first point I want to make is we talk about slips, trips and falls as a grouping, and you may have heard me talk before about this, but there's a big difference between slips and trips, and those things lead to a fall if we're talking about falls on the same level. So a bit of context here in terms of insurance claim costs and comparing slips versus trips. If you look in the retail sector, slips cause about 20% of all claims, whereas trips only cause about 8%. If we look at hospitality and leisure, slips cause a third of all claims, trips are only 7%. If you look at manufacturing, Slips are 38% of claims, trips are only 3%, so 12 times more slips than trips in manufacturing. So we need to understand that slips and trips are not the same thing, and that's important when we think about how to prevent them. So why are slips a problem then? Now, we did some research last year and we surveyed over 300 health and safety leaders, and 85% of them said that slips was a relevant risk to their customers or colleagues. However, as a health and safety leader, you, as I've used the analogy before, you're a bit like a GP. You're juggling all sorts of priorities. There's all sorts of things being thrown at you. And so even though it's a very relevant risk, it's difficult to give it the fullest attention. Coupled with that, there are some mindset gaps. I have coined a phrase called the slip problem, which is that people think that slips are simple, low cost, impossible to prevent, and paltry. Those are all misconceptions. If we have a mindset gap, then we end up with basic and superficial controls, and we also end up in this kind of status quo of paying for claims and not really doing much about it, just kind of accepting this as a cost of business. And then what does that mean? Well, we're putting in our best efforts, but despite that, we're seeing billions of pounds of costs. We're seeing something like 20% of an average insurance premium being based on slips. And as we said before, we're seeing 30% of riddles year after year after year being slips. Here's a few statistics about the size and scope of the slip problem in the UK. So broken bone every 3 minutes, 300,000 A&E admissions, 1.5 million NHS bed days, about a dozen amputations. There are deaths as well as a result of slips. So lots and lots of human costs. In terms of financial costs, we've obviously got insurance costs, we've got uninsurable risk costs as well, and then fines. So Tesco were fined just shy of £750,000 after a gentleman slipped in one of their stores and broke his hip. That fine was dished out just before the pandemic. So I've painted a rosy picture there of slips and trips and the size and scope and the fact that it's a long-lasting problem. Sounds like it could be a difficult one to overcome. The good news is that actually there are some proven methods to attack this problem, and it is possible, as I said, to see significant improvement. So stick with me now and we'll get into the meat of this, which is about how we can try to prevent these incidents from happening. So let's deal with trips first. Trip prevention is all about harm, stopping harm. Stop trips, stop harm. So this is an acronym. I'm a fan of acronyms because it makes things easy to remember. So these are the 4 things you need to think about when it comes to trips: housekeeping, awareness, routes, maintenance, harm. So housekeeping, keep obstructions clear. Fairly simple. Awareness, look where you're going, spot hazards for others, be aware of what's going on, because trips are caused by visible obstructions. On routes, plan out and monitor your walkways, and on maintenance, keep on top of holes, lips, and all those sorts of things, cleaning as well. So trip prevention, if you remember these 4 things, you can go away and implement this straight away and make a big difference on trips, because these are pretty obvious things that you can easily see and deal with. The challenge, though, is we often group slips and trips together, as I said. And if you look at the data I shared about the size of the problem, slips is a significantly bigger problem than trips. And if we start to think about the complexity of solutions, slips is a much, much more complicated matter to solve than trips. So when it comes to slips, we talk about this approach called Slipology, which is all about bringing science into slip prevention. And if you think about stopping trips, stopping harm, there's not much science involved in that. It's all kind of basic stuff, common sense, simple things. When we get into slips, even people who purport to be experts on slip safety will often fall into the trap, shall we say, of saying slips are simple to solve. And I fundamentally disagree with that. My perspective is you can make subtle changes, but they're not simple to make. If they were simple, we'd already be doing them, and we wouldn't have such a big problem in the first place. So Slipology is a 4-step method, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the takeaway points from this that you could go away and have a look at today. So the first thing is, on trips, we've got harm. On slips, we've got chimes. So tune your chimes to stop slips. These are the 6 key principles, the 6 key reasons why people slip. And what I've found over the years is when I've gone into a customer site and they're doing pretty well, they're not having many accidents, they're not having many claims, keeping their costs down, it's because they're doing these 6 things well. Conversely, when I've gone into sites and they're struggling and they do have a history of incidents, it's because they're not doing these 6 things particularly well, or perhaps they're just focusing on 1 or 2 of them, and they're not looking at the problem holistically. So let's run through this, and you'll start to kind of get a perspective on why slips is a bit more complicated than trips. So the first thing to think about is contamination. So if you have a floor that's perfectly clean and perfectly dry, then it's not going to present a slip risk. However, as soon as we introduce any kind of contamination, in other words, a barrier between the foot and the floor, that's going to change the slip risk profile. So what contamination do we have on our floors? How does it get onto our floors? How can we prevent it? Can we prevent it? How much contamination can we withstand before it becomes a problem? These are all the sorts of questions that we need to be asking about contamination. Next is heel, which is all around footwear. So clearly, in order for someone to slip, a heel has to be involved. If we're thinking about members of the public, then we can't control what people are wearing on their feet. And so there's not really much we can do proactively to take steps to address heel slip risk. However, with members of staff, we obviously can do that because it's within our gift to issue them with PPE or request certain types of footwear. So there is a certain level of control that we have over staff footwear. What I would say a big misconception around footwear is that a safety shoe means a slip resistant shoe, and that isn't necessarily the case. Just because a sole has some texture on it doesn't mean that it's slip resistant, or it may be slip resistant in certain conditions, but not in others. Next comes individual. So these are the human factors. So this is all about people. So what do we mean by that? We mean that there's some demographic stuff around likelihood of slipping in the first place. There's also some demographic stuff around the likelihood of more serious injuries. So if you're an 85-year-old woman, you're much more likely to fall and to be hurt seriously after a slip than a 25-year-old man, for example. It also means behavior. So if we are walking in a straight line at a normal speed, that's one thing. But if we are distracted, if we're pushing, if we're pulling, if we're twisting, if we're turning, if we're carrying, if we're rushing, then all of those things are going to increase the likelihood that we might slip and potentially fall and hurt ourselves. So to what extent can we manage those activities? To what extent can we inform and educate people that those activities are potentially causing risk? Can we, for example, minimize the amount of pushing, pulling, twisting, turning that our staff are doing through the way that we design our buildings and the way that we devise our work plans? These are all some of the things that we can do around the human factors within individual. Maintenance is next. That splits into 3 areas. So wear and tear is one, change of use is another, and the third one is cleaning. I'm going to give you some examples on cleaning later, but suffice to say that cleaning can be a massive contributor to slips and falls happening or not. E is environment. So this means, of course, the weather, but it also means the built environment. So entrance matting, I'm going to talk about that later, lighting, noise, steps and stairs, slopes and ramps, building entrance design, canopies, and all of that kind of stuff is picked up within environment. And then S is surface, so that's the floor. So I think we can all agree that certain types of floor are more slippery than other types of floor. But how slippery is the floor? Can we quantify that, and can we reduce the slipperiness of a floor or increase the slip resistance of the floor, if you want to look at it in a more positive way? And can we ensure that we have the right floors with the right level of safety in the right environments? So you can see here that there's actually quite a lot of breadth to managing slips, and within each of these areas there's quite a lot of depth too. So key questions would be, which of these are controllable and when? And then obviously, if we take heel with members of the public, we can't really control what they're wearing. Therefore, we tick that one off. We can't do anything there. So let's put more emphasis on the other things that we can control. Key point is that we need to look at this holistically, and we need to look at it into some depth. And we want to, where possible, try to introduce some science and some testing and quantification into all of these categories, so that we know that we're doing the right thing. So hopefully you can see now why I'm of such a firm belief that we shouldn't be bundling slips and trips together, because trips are easy to solve, but if we bundle slips in with trips, people take the view that slips are easy to solve, and actually that isn't the case. Now, looking at CHIMES, this is how the average building performs. And I'm going to explain to you how I know this in a minute, but what you can see is that overall footwear is being pretty well controlled where it's relevant. Maintenance seems to be done pretty well. Environmental factors, contamination seem to be under decent control. Where there's typically room for improvement on average is in individual, so the human factors, and on surface. And wouldn't it be useful to know how you perform on this, so that you could take steps to improve your performance? Well, the good news is that it is possible to do that. We've developed a tool which is a digital, totally free to use self-assessment called a slip prevention scorecard. So if you went to scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk, you can answer a series of questions, different questions about contamination, heel, individual, maintenance, environment, and surface. And then it's going to, based on your answers, give you a score for how your building is performing in each of those areas. And just a quick note, this is done by building, not by business. So if you're managing a chain of hotels or supermarkets or offices or something, don't fill this in for the business, fill it in for each individual building. What you get then is a breakdown of your score for each of the CHIMES, and it'll tell you whether you've got a low, high, or moderate risk depending on the scores, and then it'll start to give you some hints and tips on what you can do to improve the performance in each of those areas. So the beauty of this is you start to know where you're strongest and where you've got room for improvement, and then you can take steps in the areas where it's needed, rather than guessing, or rather than focusing your time and effort on contamination, for example, when actually you're already doing well there, and where you need to focus your time and effort is on the areas that you're doing less well. The next thing that I'd really recommend thinking about is doing a slip test, and we call this a slip safety survey, I guess, because we come in with one of our team and we do slip testing of different areas, different floors in the building, and that helps you to scientifically measure 50% of CHIMES, because you can measure contamination build-up, how well you're doing at managing that. You can measure the cleaning efficacy, and you can obviously measure the slip resistance of your floors. In the UK, we use a test called the pendulum test. This is what the HC use. It's what's used in court, and it mimics a heel striking a floor, as you're going to see in a minute. There are other tests available. What I would say is this is the gold standard test. If you were in the unfortunate position of facing a HSE criminal prosecution, and the HSE had pendulum data saying your floor was slippery, and you had data from another test saying your floor was not slippery, then there's only going to be one winner. So these other tests can have merit, but in the UK, when it comes to anything legal, this is the test that's going to carry the most weight. So I've got a quick video here of the slip test being used, the pendulum slip test. As you'll see, this guy is going to spray the floor with water. He would have tested the floor in dry conditions first, but he's going to spray the floor with water. He's going to release a foot, which is going to swing down from right to left, and it's going to strike the floor with a rubber heel on the bottom of it, in exactly the same way that your foot strikes the floor. So you're mimicking that dynamic friction between the foot and the floor. But we're standardizing the foot. So all we're measuring here is the floor, because the foot element is always the same. There are two types of rubber you can use, but it's always the same. As the pendulum, and it's called that because it swings through, it's going to push a pointer, onto the gauge on the left-hand side of the frame of this machine. And I'll explain to you what those numbers mean in a second. So let's see the pendulum slip test being used. Spray the floor with water, release the foot, swings through, and pushes the pointer onto the gauge. So hopefully you can see how that is mimicking that heel striking the floor and how you actually walk. Show it to you again. So that's how, if you're investigated or if there's an insurance claim, somebody's going to come in and test the floor and give you a scientific measure of how slippery the floor is. And that's going to tell you about, as I said earlier, contamination, maintenance, and surface. The output of the test is a number called a pendulum test value. And you can see here that there are three categories of risk. There's a high slip potential, which is a score of 24 or less. There's a moderate slip potential, which is a score between 25 and 35, and a low slip potential is a score of 36 or above. And on the middle of this chart here, you can see some work that the HSE and some other organizations did a few years back, correlating the pendulum test value, the PTV, with an accident risk exposure. So if you're over on the right-hand side of this slide with a PTV of 36 or above, then you have a 1 in a million accident risk exposure. Whereas if you're down towards the left-hand side with a PTV of 24, then you have a 1 in 20 risk exposure. That means that 1 in 20 people may suffer from a slip on your floor. That's 5%. So the benefit of the slip test is it tells you, charts where you are on here, and then you can obviously use that information to either have the certainty that you're safe, or if you're not, you can then look to figure out what you can do to reduce the risk. The second big benefit of the pendulum slip test is that if you've got the data showing that your floors passed the test, in other words, you had a low slip resistance even when wet in areas that are wet or contaminated, then you're in a very good position to defend any insurance claims made against you. David Scott, who is on this slide, is a lawyer. He heads up hospitality and leisure claims defense at a law firm called Keogh's. And he was interviewed by me on my podcast, and we were talking about somebody slipping around a swimming pool. And what David said was, somebody might slip around a swimming pool, they hurt themselves, and they immediately feel. I'm just going to put people on mute. and they immediately feel that they're entitled to make a claim. And his view was no, definitely not, because if you as the operator of that swimming pool can demonstrate that you've got compliant slip test data, that shows you're exercising your duty of care. It doesn't matter if the floor was wet. It doesn't matter if this person legitimately slipped. It doesn't matter if they legitimately hurt themselves. You've discharged your duty of care, and therefore you should expect to defend that claim. So if you've got the certification, if you've got the test data that proves the floors are safe, then you're in a very, very strong position because you know you're safe and you can prove it and use that to your advantage in the event of any action against you. So I've got 3 more quick little slip tips for you here. The first one is to deal with your floors in a zonal way. So 5% on average of floors are areas that are going to get regularly or foreseeably wet or contaminated. So it's a small proportion, but it includes lots of areas that you would understand, and pretty much every building is going to have some proportion of its floor space that is foreseeably going to be wet or contaminated, because a building entrance, for example, it absolutely it's a small proportion, but it includes lots of areas fits that bill. Sorry, just a bit of echo there, so I just muted everybody. Obviously, in some buildings, the proportion is going to be much higher. You know, if you're a seafood manufacturing business or a seafood processing business, then a lot of your floors are going to be wet or contaminated. So focus on these 5 areas because they will get wet or contaminated, and therefore they should be safe when they're wet or contaminated. Whereas the 95%, you don't really need to worry about the slip testing scores because they're not designed to be wet or contaminated, and therefore as long as you keep them clean and dry through spillage control and effective cleaning regime, then you don't need to worry. So let's be focused in our approach rather than broad brush. Second thing to think about is entrance matting. So I did a LinkedIn Live about this a couple of days ago as well, actually, as it happens, and used this photograph. Many people will say, we've got entrance matting and therefore we don't need to worry about our floors being slip resistant. As you can see in this photograph, on a wet day, you can have matting, and that's about 3 meters of matting, I would say. But beyond the matting, that floor is very, very wet indeed. So matting is only as good as its performance. 3 things to think about here. One is the size of the matting. So there's a table here showing guidance by the HC and the Entrance Flooring Association. And it suggests that if you've got a peak traffic flow through your entrance of 78 people per hour, you should have 3 to 4 meters of matting, built-in matting. Now, if you walk around offices, convenience stores, gyms, wherever you want to go, retail, and start to look at the size of entrance matting, very, very few places, very, very few buildings have anywhere near 3 to 4 meters, and that's for a low footfall. If you start getting into a high footfall of 800 people per hour at peak, then the guidance is 8 to 10 meters of matting. Very, very few buildings indeed have anywhere near that. So you can actually use your phone. There's an app called Measure on your iPhone, and you can go around and measure the size of your entrance matting and see how well it fits that bill. So the size is important. The maintenance is really important of matting. So if you've got a man-made material, it's going to be very durable, but not that effective at removing contamination and water. Whereas if you've got a natural material of mat, it's going to be more effective, but less durable and long-lasting. But all mats need to be maintained and cleaned in order to ensure their performance. So the best thing to do, and today in London is a perfect day because it was snowing this morning and now it's raining, is just stand inside your entrance on a wet day and just check, is the floor getting wet beyond the matting? If it is, then actually you need to start thinking about that floor as being a foreseeably wet area and taking steps to reduce the risk further rather than just thinking, oh, we've got matting, so we're okay. third thing to think about that you can go and do today is question if your floors are clean or not. Now, if you think about the pandemic, one of the key points that people cottoned onto was that COVID could be on a surface, but you couldn't see it on the surface. And when it comes to your floors, floors can also be contaminated, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the contamination is visible. But that contamination, particularly on a smooth floor, can significantly affect the slip resistance. So what you shouldn't do is just assume. What you shouldn't do is think that, like this floor here, for example, it looks consistent. So you'd think, well, it's got a bit of a sheen. You'd think that this floor was pretty clean. It's not until you actually clean it effectively and properly that you realize, oh, hold on a sec, actually this floor is very, very dirty. It's very, very contaminated. It's just that it's evenly dirty rather than dirty in a patchy sort of way. So I would have open eyes and open ears and be going and asking questions to cleaning staff or cleaning contractors, and actually questioning, how clean are our floors? Are they as clean as they could be? Do they look like brand new? Do we think there could be any improvements? Because the cleaning regime can have a massive, massive impact. It can take a floor that has a low slip potential when wet out of the box and give it a high slip potential when wet, just because of the amount of contamination on it. You can verify, as mentioned, the efficacy of cleaning through pendulum slip testing. You can also use hygiene safety testing as well, like swabbing, to measure how much bacteria is on the floor. The more bacteria is, the more likely it is that it's going to be contaminated and therefore slippery. If you're in the UK, why not drop me a message and ask my team to come and have a look? We can give you an impartial view and do a little test like that and show you what clean actually looks like on your floors as well. So banging on for half an hour or so about slip and trip prevention. Just wanted to explain why I'm really interested in safety and why I'm passionate about this. So if you cast your mind back 10 years or so to the summer of 2012, just before the London Olympics, London was buzzing. Everybody was so excited about what was happening. And we actually lived very close to the Olympic Park. So very close, sort of 20 minutes jogging away. Sunday, 13th of May, my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, and I had a lazy day and slept in a bit, got some breakfast around the corner, and then decided to go to this place called Columbia Road Flower Market, which is quite well known in East London, where you can, as you can see here, get flowers and have lunch and all that sort of cool stuff. So we did that, had a nice relaxing lunchtime. And then we actually had a car because we wanted to go and get some groceries in the Sainsbury's store in Islington. So we drove to Islington. We parked up the car. We walked onto the road to get into the front of the store. And I was standing more or less where that guy there is. I say standing, I was walking more or less where that guy there in the blue jumper is. And that's the last thing I remembered for about 4 or 5 hours. What had happened is a car had sped around that corner too fast, lost control, and mounted the curb and basically ploughed into me from my left-hand side. So that was me later that day in hospital with a broken collarbone, a broken wrist, broken ankle, all on my left-hand side. Cuts, bruises, scrapes, scars, and actually some neck damage as well. On the plus side, I have many fewer grey hairs in 2012 than I do now, but that's just age for you. So yeah, pretty scary thing to happen to you. You don't expect to be walking down the road in a car to mount the curb and run you over. But actually, when that does happen to you, you get a real appreciation for the value of life and the value of safety, and the fact that something can happen in an instant that can really have a profound and long-lasting effect on your life. So since that day, I've been very, very passionate indeed about safety. And why do I work in the field of slips? Well, if you go back to the data, it's the biggest cause of accident, injury and claim. And therefore, if we're going to try and have an impact on safety, let's try and do it in the biggest possible way. So with that said, then that's enough about me. What's in this? What's in this for you? If you take away the lessons from today and you go out and start preventing more slips and trips and falls in your business, what's in it for you? Well, look, straight away, you're going to have a bit more confidence because you're going to be able to be certain of taking proactive scientific steps to reduce that risk. So, and that's going to be noticed by your colleagues, it's going to be noticed by your customers, and you're going to know that you're doing the right things from a leading indicator perspective to see some good outcomes at the back end. But in the long term, what you're going to see is less harm, so fewer people getting hurt. It's going to give you more time because you're going to not be dealing with so many accident claims and accident forms and insurance claims and all of that good stuff. It's going to give you the ability to focus more and be more strategic about safety because, if you imagine if you could take slips, trips and falls from around a third to, let's say, 15%, how much time and headspace would that free up for you? I think it'd be significant. And of course, you're going to see lower costs as well. So here's what to go away and do after today. On trips, think about stop trips, stop harm. So there's a very clear roadmap here because trips are simple to stop. So think about housekeeping, awareness, routes, maintenance. Go and do it. Go and look at your housekeeping. Have greater awareness yourself, promote awareness among your colleagues. Look at your routes, think about maintenance, improve all of these things, and you will see that trips start to immediately reduce. And I say go and do it because to me, implementation is everything. It's fantastic to come and listen to me talk or attend any other number of great talks about different safety topics, but you've got to actually take this knowledge and go and do it to make it happen in your business. When it comes to slips, as we've already said, it's a big problem, but there are some massive benefits to getting it right. But it's a bit more complicated, so the roadmap's a bit less clear. Where people struggle is they come up against this wall. If you think about going from left to right on this page, you come up against this wall, and it's kind of some of the stuff that we talked about before. It's relying on the basics. It's thinking that slips are simple, and the basics aren't enough. If they were enough, we wouldn't have this size of a problem. It's having these mindset gaps, these misconceptions, and it's being stuck in this kind of status quo of just paying out claims. And that's where the Slipology approach can really help because it's a proven way of kind of jumping that wall and achieving the outcomes of clarity, of certainty, of evidence, and of having fewer accidents, injuries, and claims. So what I'd recommend is thinking about how you can go away, and as I said, implementing things is really, really important. So how can you go away and implement some of these principles of Slipology? So there's two ways that you can do that. One is 100% free, which is the scorecard that I mentioned before. So head over to scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk, fill in the scorecard, answer the questions, get your report, and then you can book in again, totally free Zoom session with me. We can run through your report, the results, any recommendations, and we can figure out, where you should be focusing your time and effort and put together a strategy to reduce slips in your business. So that's one thing that you can do straight away. It literally takes you 3 to 4 minutes to fill that in. So you can do that over a cup of tea after this call. And that will start to move you forward with a lot more clarity about what you need to do, because you'll start to have your scores for CHIMES. The other thing that we could do is, again, if you're in the UK, we could come and do a slip safety survey for you. And I'm happy to offer that at a bit of a discount for anybody that's joined me on today's session. So it's normally £500. We'll do it for £350. And that's to do a survey of your building, slip testing of 6 locations, a full report with recommendations, and certification of any floors that obviously are safe when wet. So if that could be of interest, comment slip safety survey, or drop me a DM on LinkedIn. And often if you do the scorecard, it may well be that when we speak, I recommend getting the survey done, and we'd be happy to honour the discount that we've just mentioned there. So summing up then from me, and then we'll open it up to some questions. As always, if people have got comments or thoughts, or want to ask me any clarifying questions, I guess what I'd say is, if you thought this was about slip testing and anti-slip treatments, then you've missed the point. What I'm known for, and hopefully you've kind of gleaned that from today, is trying to bring a different, proactive, fresh approach to this age-old problem, this stagnant problem, this nagging problem that just doesn't want to seem to go away. But it can go away. That's the point here. It can go away if we take this scientific approach. And hopefully what you've got out of this, the way that I want to leave you feeling, having sat through this and chatted about this with me, is that you're confident that there are things you can do. And once you've taken those steps to reduce the likelihood of slips and trips, that you've got certainty your risks are under control. I mentioned before we did the survey of safety leaders last year, and the main priority for people was to have fewer injuries, fewer accidents and injuries taking place. But the second thing that health and safety leaders said they really, really wanted was to have certainty that your risks are under control. Now, I can't promise you that we can eliminate your slips and trips. I have seen that before. It is possible, but I definitely would never promise you that we can do that. But think about all of these things that we've discussed today. If you can take a proactive approach, if you can take a scientific approach, if you can be evidencing what you're doing, you are going to have certainty that you're doing every single possible thing that you can do that's within your control to reduce risk. And so you can achieve certainty of risk control. So that's it from me. I just wanted to mention that the next safety roundtable in a couple of weeks, on the 22nd of March, is going to be an interesting one. We're going to be talking about heat maps, and Hernan, my guest, is going to explain how you should be ditching heat maps and you should instead be looking to quantify your operational and safety risks. So we talked a bit about that today, didn't we, with the slip testing and the hygiene safety testing and measuring your matting. But we're going to be talking about that in much more detail in a couple of weeks' time. So do join us for that on the 22nd of March. It's actually at 12:30 p.m, not 2:30 p.m. There's a typo there on the slide. But 12:30 p.m, as always, for the safety roundtable. Ditch those heat maps, how to really quantify operational and safety risks. So happy to take any questions now, guys. So if you've got a question, feel free to type it in the chat, or an observation or a comment. If you disagree with me, then that's also very much allowed. This is about interactive and open discussion. So feel free to type it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have as well. Somebody asked about sharing the link. I assume you mean the link for the scorecard. So let me do that. I'll quickly type that into the chat, which is scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk. Somebody sent me a question. Let me just type this on LinkedIn as well, actually. Scorecard.slipsafety. safety.co.uk. That's the way where you can get your CHIMES score. Someone's asked a question about slip test frequency. So if you end up in court and you're looking to rely upon slip test certification, I would say that the frequency that you would want to have is that the testing was done within 12 months of the accident or incident occurring. Because as we've seen by going through and looking at CHIMES, things can and do change. It's a dynamic environment. So cleaning can change, contamination can change, floors can wear and change, etc. So you certainly want to be doing a annual slip test, I would suggest. And that's certainly what the lawyers and the insurance companies that we work with would suggest as well. A few people asking about the recording. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this onto, well, firstly, it'll be available on my LinkedIn because I've gone live on LinkedIn. You can always watch back there, but I'm going to upload it onto YouTube and I will email it out to everybody that is on the Roundtable mailing list. So yeah, 12 monthly slip testing, definitely best practice. Other times to get a slip test, when you're choosing a floor to make sure you're putting the right floor in. When that floor has been installed, to make sure that it's performing as it's supposed to be. We've been involved in lots of cases over the years where someone's chosen the right floor, but then the wrong floor has been installed for various reasons. After an accident, if you're changing cleaning method, if you're changing cleaning contractor, there's lots of times where you might want to do a slip test over and above that, but I would certainly recommend doing something annually as a minimum. Oh, thanks for the feedback, Killian. Appreciate that. Is a question here from Nelson: is a slip and trip a hazard or a risk? So I would say it's a risk, not a hazard, because the hazard is the floor being wet. It's the contamination on the floor. The actual slip or trip is the risk or the incident rather than the hazard. A floor is if it's clean and dry, it doesn't present a hazard. If it's wet or contaminated, it might present a hazard, but actually it would only present a hazard if people were allowed to walk on that floor. Just because the floor's wet doesn't mean that a slip or trip will happen or a slip will happen, because if nobody's going to walk on it, a bit like a tree falling in the forest, if no one hears it, does that count? Killian, question. Yes, you can ask a question regarding slip testing. The car driving down the mini ramp. Yes, so that's called a slip alert, or it certainly used to be called a slip alert. Anyway, it might be called something else now because the company that invented it, sold the technology to someone else. But yeah, it's like a little car coming down a ramp and rolling along the floor. Now, again, if you were in the position of facing up against the HSE and they had a pendulum test saying that the floor was unsafe or the floor was slippery, and you had the slip alert saying that the floor was safe, there's only ever going to be one winner. So the pendulum test is the gold standard. If you ever watch that test being done, it slides quite a long distance along the floor. And if you think about it, when you slip, other than if you watch it in a cartoon, it's not like your heel hits the floor and then you slide along the floor for a meter and then you suddenly fall over. You slip, you lose your friction very, very quickly over a very short distance, and then you're on your bottom. So there are questions about the science about that particular test, but what I would say is any testing that you can do that gives you monitoring more regularly than your annual pendulum test is worth doing, but only if you understand what you're doing. So using the slip alert, for example, I personally wouldn't put any stock into the number that the slip alert says your floor has scored. If you score 200 or 100 or 150, I wouldn't actually care too much about what that number says, because I don't personally believe that the test is that accurate. However, if you tested your floor every single month and you always got a very close correlation month after month after month having the same score, so let's say your score was 150 and every month you got 150 or 149 or 152, something like that, then that is teaching you something. It's teaching you that the floor is being maintained in whatever level of slip resistance it was. Whereas if you went then and tested and you were getting 150 normally and all of a sudden you got 375 or whatever, then you know that something's changed, and then you can act and try to address that in one way, shape or form. So we do recommend other types of tests that people can use themselves, because the pendulum test is quite cumbersome to use. So it's not the easiest thing to do. And if you're not doing it properly, then you're not going to get accurate results. But in between those times, the slip alert and other types of tests are good ones to use just to keep monitoring a bit more frequently. Hope that helps, Killian. Question here about when choosing safety footwear, how could you check to see if it will be compatible with the floor surface? Would a slip test data be useful here? Thanks. So there are different standards of safety footwear. There's a European standard, so you can have SR, A, B or C footwear. There's also a test that's done by the HSE in the UK called a grip classification, and that measures the footwear slip resistance in different types of setting. So there are ways of quantifying slip resistance of footwear. Yes, again, as I said earlier, you need to think about the environment in which the footwear is being used. So, for example, if you've got somebody who's a kitchen porter versus somebody who is a gardener, then they're going to require totally different types of safety footwear to maintain slip resistance. So it's about the type of floor, it's about the type of contamination, it's about the use, and all sorts of things like that. Another question here from Killian about dust. So can dust on a floor be quantified in terms of friction loss? So absolutely. So dust is a type of contaminant. And if you do a pendulum slip test on a floor that's very dusty, what you're going to see is that the dry test is much, much lower than you might otherwise expect. So, and it could even be the same as if the floor were wet. So if you do a slip test and the dry slip resistance score, the dry pendulum test value is fairly low, that's a very good indication that there's some kind of contamination on the floor, which could be dust, could be grease, could be any number of other things as well. But you will see a difference between a floor that is dusty and a floor that is not dusty and is properly clean and properly dry when it comes to the slip resistance. Yes, so that's something definitely that the slip test can pick up on. Good stuff. Any further questions? I'm conscious we've been going for about an hour, so I normally try and wrap this up in about an hour. Yep. Gershom, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, Christian, just a quick one. As we focus on the slip, trips and fall in the workplace now, the surface you're talking about most concentrating on the flow. What about the platforms? For example, if like in my work area, we do the cleaning of the AC units for the trains.
Yep.
Overhead. Yeah, so for those people who are on the platform on top,
yep.
Recently we had an issue. Somebody raised that their footwear is slippery and they might they'll be risking themselves if they do that activity. So
Yep.
does this apply on that particular surface, even though it's not the floor? Or
Yep. Yep. No, absolutely. So CHIMES as a risk assessment approach will be the way that I would assess any kind of environment. But the point is that you sometimes might not be able to control certain aspects of CHIMES. So, but if you're looking at that platform, it's exactly the same. So the surface of is the surface that you're going to walk on, whatever that surface might be. If you are managing risk for a logistics company and your staff are delivering packages to businesses or people's homes or whatever, then you'd still look at CHIMES, but obviously you wouldn't be able to control the surface, and therefore you'd try and place greater emphasis on some of the other aspects. So I'd certainly would look at the surface of those platforms, and I would try to understand to what extent they might be slippery or not. And you could do a slip test on those platforms to help to answer that question. I'd also be looking at all the other factors around CHIMES and trying to figure out what we can do, what's within our control that could reduce the risk of people slipping. And I would take the same approach for pretty much any. I can't think of any example where you wouldn't use CHIMES, but as I say, sometimes not every one of the CHIMES is controllable.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, pleasure. Okay, good. Well, look, thank you guys. I really enjoyed that. Hope you did too. There's been some lovely comments in the chat, so I really appreciate it. Do go and use the scorecard. As I say, it only takes 2 or 3 minutes, but it will give you a lot of valuable insights on the likelihood of slips in your buildings. Do go away and look at harm around trips. Do go and consider CHIMES. And if you want some help from my team and I in terms of a slip safety survey, then there's that offer there for you as well for a discounted price. So do take advantage of that too. See you in a couple of weeks for the next safety roundtable about ditching heat maps and quantifying risk. And have a great rest of the day in between time. Thanks very much, everyone.